This video is about the misunderstandings or misconceptions, if you will, that the Western societies have with regards to the science of yoga. Well, to understand this misunderstanding or miscommunication, if you will, we need to look a little bit at the history of the Western societies. Now, some will tell you, some historians and philosophers will tell you that there was a pivotal moment in the history of the Western societies. And this was what was seen as a break between the famous philosopher Aristotle and his friend and former teacher Plato. There's a famous picture of Plato pointing to the sky, which means pointing to an ideal, pointing to metaphysics, that means a dimension beyond physics. And Aristotle pointing down to the ground, pointing to matter, therefore representing the modern scientific inquiry, the modern physics. Both of them, of course, share an aspect of reality. Plato embodied more the mystical, while Aristotle laid the groundwork for the modern deductionism which led to our understanding of basic physics and technology. Even though this debate between the two might not have been the cause for the separation of the mystical and the so-called scientific, it surely is one of the points in human history where a sense of a divide was created that wasn't necessary. You see, Plato in his wisdom wasn't in denial of what a student was telling about the science of matter. But he saw it as a limitation, for very good reasons. Now, often the Western societies emphasize the Greek philosophy traditions as the birth ground for modern science and also for modern Western philosophy. In Western society, we speak of smart people as thinkers because this is what the West identifies with, and that is intellect. Now, intellect is born out of the brain. For someone in the East, a yogi, this would be the lower mind, not the higher mind, but the lower mind, the limited mind, the biocomputer survival mind that is trapped in space-time and in a very limited set of physics. But to the Westerner, this is the object of identification. And because to the Westerner it is the object of identification, the Westerner struggles tremendously integrating other approaches with regards to an inquiry of what reality is. So while the Westerner, because of the limitations of the senses, tries to augment those senses with technology. That means if you can't see in the dark, for example, you can have an infrared light, night vision goggles, and it enhances your senses, it augments your senses. This is what the Westerner has focused on, an augmentation of senses, and it means at looking at the world, or looking at the unobservable physics, not the observable physics through the human senses, but the unobservable physics through the human senses through augmentation. Basically placing technology, that means a machine that interprets the metaphysical as a form of data or program or AI logic to the human, so the human can make sense of it. So basically the human tries to use machines in the West to interpret the higher physics into a limited code of understanding, which is a rudimentary form of logic. A yogi does no such thing. A Buddhist monk does no such thing. A Gnostic does no such thing. A Sufi does no such thing. What have all the mystical traditions in common if they lead to profound experiences? They have in common that through mystical practices, which is nothing but the tuning into higher dimensions, via letting go of the lower nature, if you will, of the lower biology vehicle, the mystic begins tuning into higher dimensions, and therefore experiences reproducible phenomena. So when the mystics start teaching those type of techniques to any human being, and they dedicate it, they also start entering the experience of higher physics. But how does it happen? Not through augmentation, but through upgrading, enhancing the nervous system, changing the DNA, increasing in energy, opening energy vortexes in the body, and therefore creating a link with a multidimensional reality that is beyond space-time and the logic of, let's say, Newton. Now, the Westerner more and more has begun to understand, through the advancement of theoretical physics and quantum physics and string theory, that they have reached a point, a threshold that they can't cross over. So there are some scientists in the West who are open enough, curious enough to say, let's invite mystics from the East and let's try to investigate their effects on matter, to go beyond the idea that consciousness would be produced by the brain. Now, why does the Westerner insist on the intellect as the main instrument of inquiry? To understand this, we need to look at the history of the Catholic Church. For centuries, the European was living under the yoke of the Church, oppressed in every way, oppressed in sexual expression, suppressed in his scientific discovery, in his curiosity, suppressed in thought and belief. Now, the Western society was reborn in the time of Renaissance, which began what you could call the Western Age of Enlightenment. But to the Westerner, the Enlightenment was a separation from the oppressive Church, an emphasis on the sovereignty of the individual, but it was still based massively on intellect. Now, the abuse of the Church, the abuse of power, and the greed and the oppression of the individual has led to an overemphasis of the individual, because now the spiritual was mistrusted. Science was seen as a new savior, because science could, initially through theory, but then through experiment and verification, show that our observation of nature and of physics work, because we can reproduce the result. When someone tells you how to produce electricity and they write it down in a book, and you can reverse engineer that and you can produce electricity or tune into electricity, then this is a proof of a natural law. The Christian Church did not prove their idea of mystical laws. And this made people in the West profoundly mistrust any religious concept. So in order to free themselves from the oppression, they were looking for reason and science. Now, the Westerner has found a certain comfort in that because technology works. But still, the Westerner has not answered the deepest existential questions. And in the realm of philosophy, the limitations of thought are reached. Western thought will not go deeper by insisting on intellect as the method of inquiry. Thankfully, in the century to come, we will experience a new renaissance. And this is to bridge the gap, or the seeming divide that doesn't really exist, but it's a conceptual divide between religion and the sciences, through the mystical process, because the mystical process is a fusion between intellect and intuition. Now, the Westerner started struggling with the birth of quantum physics. Some of the fathers of quantum physics, like Erwin Schrödinger or Heisenberg or Max Planck, were mystically inclined, because they very quickly realized those effects that we are observing, that we first described mathematically but then through experiment, cannot be explained by the model of Newton. It cannot be even explained by the model of Einstein. So the modern science that will arise will be one of spirit and technology coming into fusion. That is an exciting time. There are many people who are afraid of technology, but there are also many people who are afraid of religion. But it is never what we do. You see, it's not the curiosity that is the issue. It is not the tool as such. The question is, how do we use the tool? What's the consciousness behind the tool? Is it a consciousness that is compassionate? Is it a consciousness that is patient? Is it a consciousness that acts from union and not from separation? Or is it an ego consciousness that looks for gain, that is greedy and not kind? You see, with that type of consciousness, everything becomes a weapon. Religion becomes a weapon, technology becomes a weapon, even love, even sex becomes a weapon, you see. But a loving consciousness, a compassionate consciousness that seeks oneness and understanding, can use technology and spiritual inquiry in a compassionate way, in a loving way, in a wise way. And this type of renaissance is what we are seeking. Now, the Westerner, when trying to understand the science of yoga, or for example the system of Buddhism, often got very confused. Because the philosophers in the West and the psychologists and so on, they got introduced to Buddhism, for example, and the only way they could make sense of it is by saying, well, Buddhism is a philosophy. Why? Because René Descartes, the philosopher, said, I think, therefore I am, which is the ego state of consciousness. It's the identification with thought, therefore to identify with the thinker. So someone who creates a system must be a thinker, therefore it must be a system of thought, therefore it must be a philosophy. But that it was a practice, and still is, a practice of self-realization, a practice of going beyond thought, is for the one who is not willing to leave the realm of thought, because that is the comfort zone, who protects them from the superstition and the church and the crazies and so on, right? For someone like that, that's a scary idea. To go beyond thought. To go beyond the comfortably set up cage of confinement of identity. So therefore, the Buddhists often try to convey to the Westerner who is interested in intellectual debates, sit down, shut up, breathe. The Westerner is very quickly bored because he's not receiving information. He's like, something must be wrong here, I'm not receiving information. But it's the training to go beyond mind that the Westerner struggles with. This sphere of the higher physics that are beyond the observation of the human. Until the human evolves, that such realities become, if you will, the new default. Now, the Westerner has treated Buddhism as a philosophy and not as a system of practice realization, because practice realization doesn't make sense to the Westerner. The Westerner is interested in objects of thought, intellectual objects, technology, gadgets. And the Buddhist wants to be free of all of that. Wants to go beyond the need for comfort, beyond the need for just having a pleasurable life, beyond the need for just manipulating their environment to be safe, you see? So then, yoga met a similar fate when the Westerner tried to understand it. The Westerner could only make sense of it from the perspective of Newton's physics. It was concerned with the movement of objects and matter. He could only make sense of the movements, of the stretching, of the muscle exercises, maybe the breathing exercises. But what the Westerner could not make sense of was the Kriya Yogas, the higher energy yogas, where you call in energy to transform the human vessel, to transform the nervous system, transform the DNA, to create an avatar that is continuously, without interruption, perceptive of or sensitive to spirit. Since the Westerner couldn't make sense of it because thought wouldn't get the Westerner there, the Westerner took the physical exercises. Because someone who thinks that he is a thinker is identified with the brain, and the brain is attached to the body. So like, oh, I have effects on my brain if I do body exercises. But it doesn't lead to realization. The science of yoga is therefore profoundly misunderstood. Because the physical exercises are beneficial, yes. They help you, let's say, remove blockages from the system so energy can move more freely. They temporarily increase your energy frequency, so the potential of tapping into a higher state of being, it is a bit more easily accessible. It is about building a bridge. But then people get stuck with the physical exercises. They practice yoga for 20 years and they still do the same physical exercises. This is a waste of time and a waste of energy, because it does not lead to realization. What leads to realization are the Kriya Yoga, the energy yoga that leads to transformation of the nervous system, to a rewiring of the very physics of the human being. So the human being becomes multidimensional, not trapped in time, not trapped in an A, B, C, D, E logic, but in a multidimensional logic that is beyond the intellect. To go beyond it, to experience this type of freedom, that leads to liberation. That is a process, yes. But the Westerners are often not interested in that process because they see a monk meditating or a yogi meditating and it looks utterly boring from the outside. They say nothing is happening because their attention is on the matter, on the lower physics. They cannot see what happens in a higher realm. They cannot see where the yogi is traveling, what visions the yogi has, what communication the yogi is experiencing. Therefore, the Westerner needs to let go of the intellect as the method of inquiry, because we have explored the intellect to the maximum. The intellect will not lead to the evolution that we're seeking, to the liberation, to a great degree of freedom and sovereignty. The overuse of the intellect has led to an addiction, because it has trapped us in our biosurvival mechanism, has made us greedy and selfish and disconnected. In order to reconnect, we need to let go of the intellect, understand yoga as a form of alchemy, as a form of transformation, and energy exercise, practice realization, and not as a physical exercise. Now, a master yogi doesn't spend so much time doing these physical exercises. A master yogi does his energy meditation. And maybe just with 30 minutes of energy meditations, it has a more profound effect on the body than 2 hours of physical yoga would. That is energy efficiency. So what we're trying to do in this process of realization, we're trying to increase in energy with a minimum of effort. And to the Westerner who focus on the physical labor, this might sound lazy, but it's just wisdom. So, if you truly want to understand the mystical systems, if you want to understand yoga, or Buddhism, or Hinduism, or the Gnostics in Christianity, or Sufism, or whatever, these are all just concepts, these are all just words. But behind it are practices that get you into the ocean. And the intellect is sitting on the beach debating what the ocean is like and not even dipping a toe into the water. The mystic becomes a primary source, not a secondary source of information. The mystic merges with the ocean, and later he might translate it into words, but he's aware it is a translation, the words are not the truth. They are an encoding that is limiting the truth. But it can be used to make people curious. And maybe some of them become curious enough that they seek to liberate themselves from their limited circumstances. Contemplate about that, my friend. Be well.